I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to foster order in our mad world, and try to propose genuine win-win solutions that are actually in everyone's best interests. And as the mega orderers out there will know, my primary contention about our global system is that if various actors coordinated better, we could achieve better outcomes for everyone. And one of the key features of our era of global enduring disorder is that this coordination is not currently happening, and we are suffering the consequences of these suboptimal outcomes. Nowhere is this more true than over climate change. In short, at no time in human history has the globe been more in need of global governance, and yet, at no time in history have the institutions and powers that could deliver that governance been more dysfunctional. So the time has come to revisit the issue of climate change and the global enduring disorder, but this time from another angle. We're having a live studio recording to debate an issue which is central to the concept of the Disorder Program. And that issue is, quote, is it actually in the long-term interest of most major states, citizens, and major multinational corporations to work together to fight climate change and to create global governance institutions which penalize carbon emissions and incentivize the green transition? Or is it rational for states or corporations like oil-producing states in the Arabian Gulf or major international oil companies to fight the creation of global coordination mechanisms, delay the energy transition, and play the role of disorderers, seeking to profit from the current high demand for the fossil fuels that they either export or produce? End quote. That is the question under study today. I am of the belief that it is genuinely in everyone's long-term interests to work hand in glove and facilitate the energy transition. However, we're going to hear from a panelist today, Hassan, who challenges that view and asserts that it is not necessarily in the interest of oil-producing countries, such as those in the Arabian Gulf, to see a speedy energy transition or to want coherent global governance of carbon emissions. It's therefore a great thrill to be joined at the studio here in King's Cross by Olivia Azadegdin and Hassan Damlouji. Hassan Damlouji is a British-Iraqi development expert and author of The Responsible Globalist, What Citizens of the World Can Learn from Nationalism. He's also the co-founder of a do tank, Global Nation, which focuses on improving international cooperation to combat climate change, pandemics, inequality, and conflict. Ahlan wa sahlan, ya Hassan.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for inviting me on.
Next, we are joined by Olivia Azadegdin, a British Iranian. She's a fellow at the Women Leaders in Energy and Climate Change at the Atlantic Council and a winner of a Forbes 30 Under 30 award. Khosh Amadeen, Olivia.
Thank you so much, Jason, and thank you so much for having me. This is super exciting conversation, so I'm very much looking forward to this.
Could you start by painting a bit of a picture in terms of where we're at in the so-called energy transition? And what's the role of renewables and fossil fuels in this transition process?
So since the first COP, globally, the world, we are up 20% on CO2 emissions. And we're really living in a reality where the world is still 80% reliant on fossil fuels, and demand is growing faster than the carbon reduction. So we're seeing continued growth in fossil fuel infrastructure. We're seeing demand increasing. But that being said, we have seen some important gains in renewables. And we are seeing fast growth in renewables. We saw a commitment as part of COP for a tripling of renewable energy by 2030. This is all essential. But what I would describe the climate and the energy transition space, how I would characterize that now, is largely by a period of energy addition. So we are adding renewables whilst also growing the demand in fossil fuels.
Some fantastic innovation is happening, and we've just heard from Olivia that people are coming up with new ways to generate energy in a less carbon-intensive way. But the economy and population is still growing, and as countries are going to become more and more middle class, like India and China, they're just demanding more and more energy. We haven't solved that. So, Hassan, what's the role of the MENA region in this energy transition process?
I think the Middle East and North Africa region is, of course, quite diverse. It includes some of the poorest countries in the world and some of the richest, and quite a few that are in between. But one thing that characterizes the entire region is that it has a high dependence on revenue from hydrocarbons. Even poor countries like Yemen derive most of their foreign exchange from that. Countries like Egypt, have gas exports. Even countries that have almost none, like Jordan or Morocco, are part of an economic network that depends on countries that do. And then, of course, you have the big economies that are massive producers of hydrocarbons. And so there is a high dependency, but there is also an extremely high vulnerability to climate change as well across the MENA region. All countries are characterized by that too. And that puts them in a very conflictual position. I think, welcome the topic of this podcast, because they really are an extreme test case, because they stand to lose so much from the burning of fossil fuels, but also to lose so much from stopping burning fossil fuels. It makes it a really interesting region to look at as we think about how possible that transition is.
You could say that climate change is a high-stakes gamble everywhere, but it's no more high stakes than in the Middle East. That the questions of both the economies on the one side and then the weather, like, are these places going to become absolutely uninhabitable? So where are these oil-producing Arab countries and also Iran, where are they at in terms of, are they bringing down their emissions? Are they curbing consumption? Or is it quite the opposite, that these are countries where traditionally they've subsidized consumers and that they are, in a way, paying people to consume petrol by making it less than the market rate? Where is that whole story at right now?
For many countries, there is a realization that to play effectively diplomatically, you need to show some efforts. I think there's also a realization that it may be a good idea to invest in technologies that will provide jobs outside of the hydrocarbon industry in order to diversify. And there's also, really importantly, a recognition that just to maximize your revenues from this industry, you want to increase the efficiency, potentially sell more to others and use less at home. I remember over a decade ago, there were projections that says if Saudi Arabia keeps increasing its consumption of oil on the same trend as it was at the time, and also increases its production at the same trend, then actually they would be net importers of oil in Saudi Arabia by the year, whatever it was, 2035 or 2040. Right? So yes, efforts have been made to modify the way that hydrocarbons are exploited and consumed in the region. But fundamentally, there has not been a decisive move to transition.
So, Olivia, from your perspective, are some countries in the Gulf doing better than others? Can we look at, say, the UAE maybe doing some things a little bit better than Saudi, and then some other countries lagging behind? How would you kind of differentiate this for us?
Yeah, so I think it's first important to just highlight the complexities of the energy system and what exactly it is we're trying to do here, the scale we're talking about. So in order to do this, we really need long-term policy planning, and the energy transition roadmaps from the IEA do demonstrate that this is a long game. So to my mind, the region is home to many national oil companies, sovereign wealth funds, state-owned actors that really provides good conditions for that long-term policy planning for the energy system transformation. And whilst the MENA region is home to a lot of these national oil companies, it is one of the world's largest energy hubs with actors that have financial resources, technical know-how, and influence in the global energy market. So it's imperative that if we're thinking about what is the Gulf's role, what is the Middle East's role, the Gulf does have unique properties and unique conditions to be able to embark on an energy transition, climate-compatible pathway. The biggest emitters in the region are also the biggest asset owners, and there is potential for the NOCs to do similar to what we've seen in Norway, where the government has banned flaring or burning of natural gas, which is methane, and banned methane leakage.
Totally agree with Olivia that many of the structures are in place in some of these countries to do long-term planning and invest in that in a way that may not be as easy in democratic countries. But at the same time, why would I plan over the long term for something that's not actually in my interest? And I think this really comes to the heart of the question you asked in your introduction, Jason. At the end of the day, collective action is difficult. And collective action has a science around it, the science of collective action, which really is around the game theory of at what point is it in my interest to provide collective goods that everyone will benefit from. And reducing greenhouse gases is a perfect example of that. Everyone will benefit from less carbon emissions because the temperature will come down in an indiscriminate way, but only I will bear the costs of my own decision to contribute to that. It is not in the interest of Gulf countries to do that. Saudi Arabia could give up all of its income, others still burn, and their temperature still goes up. It's not worth their while running that gamble unless global governance fundamentally changes, unless their incentive structure fundamentally changes.
So I just wanted to come in here on a point around just circling back on the methane pollution, because methane is really the best strategy we have to slow climate change in the next 2 decades. The reason why is it is short-lived greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. It's 80 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide, and it is responsible for about half of a degree of the current warming. And the majority of methane emissions comes from the fossil fuel sector. So it is really the lowest hanging fruit that we have and critical to keeping global warming goals within reach and avoiding near-term climate impacts. The other point that I wanted to make about methane is it is within everyone's interest. It is a cost-effective strategy. It is just mitigating methane leakage with current operations. So you're not requiring massive restructuring of markets or fuels.
And in fact, it's so win-win. I want to kind of explain this methane issue, but man, am I happy she didn't say methane. I mean, I love having some of these beautiful British accents and all of that, but methane, please, I can't take it seriously. The methane issue is something that I came to experience in my work in Libya, where they do a lot of gas flaring. Let me explain to you what gas flaring is. Let's say that you're drilling to get at an oil field, say in Sharara in southwestern Libya, and there's lots of crude oil there. But as the crude oil is coming up, there's lots of what's called associated gas. And associated gas is something that can be used to produce energy. It's a hydrocarbon. It can be burned. You can make electricity from it. You could do, for example, the liquefaction of it. But it comes out not when you were trying to get it. It comes out while you're trying to get the crude oil. And in places like Libya and Russia, where they don't have some of the advanced technologies in the drilling process, they just can't capture it and they burn it off. And it is horrible for the environment and it creates the methane. And this issue really hit me like 1,000 kilograms of bricks in my face when I was at a trade mission in Tripoli in Libya. And the head of the NOC threw out a figure about the gas flaring. And then someone in the audience said, no, I think it's 10 times higher than the figure that you said. And then we did the research and we realized it was 100 times higher than the initial figure, and that Libya flares more than the United States and Canada put together. Do you know what I mean? That the amount that's being flared, just for example, at this one field, Sharara, is astronomical and astronomically bad for the environment. And the technology exists to, for example, create electricity from this associated gas. And Libya is a place where they have blackouts. They have rolling blackouts all the time. So this is an example of a collective action opportunity. And I wanted to underscore this for listeners, that we see here, if we zoom in on this issue, why there can be win-win opportunities to do this energy transition, whereby some Libyans who, for example, not only don't have air conditioning, but their fridges go off for 8 hours a day, and then the blood samples in the hospital get contaminated, can actually fix this issue while making more money for the country.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And it begs the question, why is this issue dealt with in some places more than others? And I think when you think about how do we solve collective action problems, one of the leading theories says And of course, if you have just blanket enforcement, then that works and people have to obey. But that's not the case for the world. So that's not a good model.
Also, how do we enforce?
Well, exactly. We don't have. You might have that at a national level, but at the global level, that is not the situation we're living in. So how does it happen in community? How do you get collective action in non-enforcement scenarios? And the idea is to say people treat each other individually to some degree based on their reputation for doing the right thing. So if you have a good reputation, individual benefits will come to you. People will be nice to you. Various benefits you can imagine accruing from that because you have a reputation of helping with that other problem that everyone will receive the benefits. And that is how you are able to encourage in society people to do the right thing, even though they wouldn't have an incentive on their own. And it struck me when you were talking about Libya that the people producing oil from these fields, because of the nature of their position within the international order or disorder, there isn't strong governance there. Libya is a disordered place itself. They may not have a lot of reputation incentives, right? Because they are not part of other global diplomatic discussions that says, hey, will you back me for this or horse trade on that treaty or negotiation, right? And so the very marginal status of Libyan actors will reduce the ability for us to have reputational impact. I think a country like Saudi Arabia, which has an important place in various international discussions, wants to ensure it has a positive reputation on various issues because it will receive not just the benefits of reduced global warming, but other benefits from that reputation. And so that's an incentive for them to do at least something. So the other thing you can do is, of course, reduce the costs, right? Okay, you're asking me to forego costs and you're asking me to build a good reputation. The less I care about my reputation, the more you have to make it cheaper for those people to do it. And that's where I think in Libya, there's got to be an international support that makes it easier for those actors to take those actions.
You may even have to give them rewards. In other words, rather than saying we're going to penalize you for doing this, because it's very difficult to penalize Libya. They don't pay their debts and they violate the arms embargo and whatever, but you could give them rewards. We see that you, for example, decrease 25% of your gas flaring. Here's some more visas for your students to study engineering in the US and the UK. And that's something that I would really get behind.
And this, to me, shows the problem with the big picture, right? Because methane may be an issue that is a low-hanging enough fruit, to Olivia's words, that we can create incentives strong enough to incentivize the right action. But creating rewards sufficient to offset Saudi Arabia's incentive to keep exporting oil, the rewards would have to be so astronomical that we probably can't afford it as a world or don't have the willingness to pay Saudi Arabia to sit with the oil under its ground. And I find it much harder to see the full energy transition to being effectively incentivized in the Middle East.
Yeah, so I think just a point on where is the incentive coming from. For these oil-producing countries, we do have to square off the fact that they're producing a lot of what the rest of the world is reliant on. They're exporting about 90% of what they're producing. So the question then becomes, this is a collective action challenge, because is it the producers or is it the consumers? And I argue it's both. And both sides of the market, the production side and the demand side, need to have an honest conversation around that. So in terms of what incentives could you give, there do need to be incentives on the demand side as well. So if you are buying this product, there needs to be climate controls around methane monitoring and what data is available. Are you willing to pay the higher cost of capital for that cleaner alternative? The other thing I wanted to mention on that as well, for the non-wealthy actors that are producing this that the rest of the world is reliant on, there needs to be diversification in how we think about climate technology. So a lot of the multilateral development banks that give climate project financing to projects do not touch fossil fuels. And this is where we really need to diversify the way we think about climate tech, because if we're honest with ourselves that the demand for this stuff is going to be growing in the developing world and in the global south. If we're honest with ourselves about the fact that even if we turned off fossil fuels today, there's still going to be this stuff around for quite some time. So we can either bury our head in the sand and do nothing about it, or we can finance and put the policies and the regulatory frameworks in place to make those changes. So really, the way we think about climate, we need to diversify it. We need to finance those projects. We need to the wealthy countries will need to finance that for themselves with the demand side. But then on the developing country side, there needs to be the financing in place to be able to do that as well.
That was a lovely answer, and there's a lot to unpack. I want to give a little bit of a backgrounder here for our mega orderers out there. Not every barrel of oil that is produced and consumed has the same environmental impact. And a barrel of oil which is produced, for example, in Libya with clean technology that hasn't had to be transported a great distance to the UK or to Italy, and that it hasn't required much drilling, that could be a very carbon efficient barrel. And then there's like the Venezuelan or Canadian shale barrel, where that's a very dirty barrel that's had to be refined a lot, and there's been a lot of energy that stuff goes into it. So not all barrels of oil are created equally. Now, to unpack what Olivia has just said with the knowledge that I've given there, it's that to transition to some of these cheaper forms of energy is a capital-intensive project, but it can work for everyone and can allow us to, for example, make more money while doing things that are better for the environment if that capital is allocated in an efficient way. And that's where I want to frame things. Is it that there are win-win solutions out there that we've just fucked up politically, and it's like the HS2 thing, the money has been wasted and we didn't get it? Or is it that there is a genuine tug of war between some oil-producing countries and companies who don't want this to happen because their interests are really harmed?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of framing it. There are definitely win-wins that we're just dumb for not doing them, right? And then there's the things that we're dumb for not doing, but they're politically extraordinarily difficult. If you think about solving the collective action problem and you say, well, we're going to rely on some hydrocarbons at least into the future, right? Then America should stop producing almost all oil and should sign the security arrangement that the Saudis want it to sign and secure its supply from Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East, because their cost of production, both in terms of dollars and also in terms of the environmental impact, is lower, right? And so from an environmental point of view, it is a crazy thing for us as a world to be digging new shale wells in America. It makes absolutely no sense for the reason it makes sense is America wants to do it because of their security of supply, for their revenue. And so to expect the last countries to give up their production as we wean ourselves off oil are the ones that we put the most pressure on, whose reputations we're comfortable shredding first, these bad Arab countries for lots of reasons, whereas many other countries, and first of all America, which is not seen internationally, it's seen as a knowledge economy, it's seen as an industrial economy, it's actually an oil economy to a great extent. That is where we should be looking for the collective action problem to be solved first. And if you think it's very difficult to convince America to stop burning shale oil, then you shouldn't even be asking then the question about a country like Saudi Arabia, UAE, or Qatar.
Wow, that puts such a fine line under this issue. And man, I'm thrilled that we're celebrating 9 months of the Disorder Pod with this live show, because Hassan has just explained that we can't do collective action globally because in the world's largest economy, with the most powerful defense industries in human history, we can't even do collective action internally because of the political pulls and the different interests between, say, a manufacturer, a shale producer, a consumer, and then the politicians who, for example, due to the Electoral College, really need to weight the interests of people in Montana and Oklahoma. And I don't think that we've hit that as crystal clear yet, that these disordering elements lie within our democratic systems themselves. How are we going to get over this, Olivia?
Well, I think we talk about the main issue is we talk about the costs of action with all this and how...
What about the costs of inaction?
Exactly, the cost of inaction. So if we fail to get a grasp on methane pollution, CO2 emissions, all greenhouse gas emissions. This will be an intense cost of capital, but also in terms of human life.
That's a jargony term. What is cost of capital?
So we're looking at our balance sheets and our policy making for today. But again, this needs to be for long-term planning. And it's very easy when you're in business cycles to plan for within your term of office. But the energy transition, it's much longer time horizons. It requires much more seasoned, long-term strategic planning and thinking. So we need to start thinking about financing the initial timeline, and the cost of inaction in the future will be a lot more costly, which is something that is quite hard to think about when it's outside your terms of office or your term as leader of a corporation. But it is going to have a huge expense, and we will pay if we don't move quickly. And it is something that everyone needs to worry about, because it is about the quality of life on the planet. And I think just one point I'd wanted to make, just to bring it back to the topic of this podcast about MENA countries and do they have an incentive? I mean, I myself have spent the past 3.5 years in the Middle East. We know how it feels with the Gulf countries that have unbearable heat. They're really not immune from the effects of climate.
Not at all.
And if there isn't an incentive there for the cost, there is a long-term incentive for them to secure the region's future, their country's future. But back to the collective action challenge, it is a producer and a consumer conversation, and we need to have very honest conversations within the markets around that. And then I wanted to circle back on one other point you made about the production and the emissions associated with that. I think Europe, we do need to be very honest as well with ourselves that we are the biggest fossil fuel importer, and the majority of emissions come from the consumption, what you call scope 3 emissions, when you actually burn the fuel, which is why we need to not think so simplistically about this. We need to fuel switch where we can for road transport, which we're seeing with the electrification of our road transportation systems. But we'll also need to think about the demand for energy. It will be different types of energy for different sectors. So we really can't forget about what you call the hard to abate sectors, the manufacturing industry, chemicals, steel, cement, and these cannot use electricity. So we don't have alternatives. So this is where we need to think that the demand is going to change into different industries. We'll see industries transform, but that demand for those hard to abate sectors is where we really need to make sure that we're not greenwashing and not doing everything we can, electrifying where we can, but at the same time being very honest that these industries that don't have a clean alternative right now, we need to put the climate tech in place, the finance in place, the policy in place, so that we can get the projects built. But the more we debate that, the harder it is going to be for us to see any progress.
So the cost of inaction, to summarize here, is that because the perfect is the enemy of the good, very little has happened, and there are some things that could be being done that are not.
There are some things that could be being done that are not. And I think gradually really important things that need to be done are being done. And I think the problem is it's too gradual. But what you're going to see with some luck, but quite realistically, is increasing reductions in the cost of competitors to hydrocarbons. We've already seen that. And therefore, the economic case for taking them up grows over time. There's also public demand, right, even in these oil-producing countries to install solar capacity. And you'll gradually get a transition. What you have to think about then is what does that do to the price of oil? What you would expect to happen is the world I portrayed as being desirable, whereby the first producers to go are these very dirty, high-cost ones, and that some of these Gulf countries actually are the last ones standing because that's the best barrel of oil to get in terms of costs in various dimensions. That'll happen because as people want less oil, the price goes down, and it no longer is economical for American producers to dig for shale, right? So that happens gradually. the overall revenue of those countries goes down from hydrocarbons, even the ones who carry on producing. They have more and more incentive to build these other technologies, use the sovereign wealth funds to invest in that. That speeds up the transition. The problem we have is that that is not on a 1.5 degrees of warming timescale, right? And so the question is, if you are determined to speed that up and to save Tuvalu from going underwater, how do you create that? And I think I actually disagree, Jason, with the point that you made right at the beginning, where you said the international institutions have never in history been so badly set up to deal with it. I think we may have had a downward trend over the last few years, but over the long span of history, we've never had international institutions so strong. I mean, don't forget, before the Second World War, we had no UN system. And then from the Second World War up until 1990, we had a Cold War. This may not be the best time in the last 30 years, but it is not a bad time by historical standards in terms of the institutions we've built. We are
For purely international institutions, I take your point, but what I meant is hegemonic ordering. In other words, that pretty much from the Peace of Westphalia until 2003 or 2011, depending on how you look at it, there's been hegemonic ordering on top table issues. We've had some interregnums like the interwar period. We've had some moments like during the Napoleonic Wars where who was the hegemonic orderer swung back and forth. But certainly from 1815 until 2011, you had an Anglo-American hegemonic orderer which could make decisions about the terms of trade, how to keep the sea lanes open. And we don't have that now. And I am of the belief, because I'm running this Disorder podcast, that we need a top table orderer. It's probably going to be a coalition rather than one superpower, as had been done for the 200 years precedent. But we don't have a top table coalition on the issues of the day. And I would argue that climate change is literally maybe next to avoiding nuclear Armageddon as the top table issue of the day. We don't have hegemonic ordering where Russia and China and the Gulf countries and Europe and North America are on the same page.
So we are losing the hegemonic ordering. And that, I think, creates lots of risks, but also wonderful opportunities, particularly on climate. We've just discussed how the United States has done very well over the last decade from completely ignoring climate science and profiting from the oil, the dirty, expensive oil underneath its feet, right? And that incentive structure is not changing from Democrat to Republican. Biden has issued more drilling permits than Trump did.
Yet the firms still want to back Trump. Why is that?
Well, they may think that Trump will double it again. The point is the Democrats are not reducing oil production. And so the multipolar world provides an opportunity for the sort of peer pressure that we discussed earlier as being so important. Right now, with America being still quite hegemonic, you don't need to burnish your reputation by cutting your oil because the big player in town isn't either. Whereas if you had more of a coalition of countries that included countries that are not oil producers, if India, China, Germany, Japan were part of a more important part of the peer pressure that created the incentive structure of the international system, you might actually get the kind of nudging and cajoling that would lead to the outcomes we want. With America as the hegemon, forget about it. Their interests are keep burning shale.
Let's get back to the big picture political questions. Hassan, how do the incentive structures in Middle Eastern countries differ from those in the oil-consuming industrial economies? America might be both, so let's just look at a place like bog standard continental European country, France or Germany. They import energy, as opposed to the Saudis or Kuwaits or Qatars, they export energy. What are their different incentives as they're planning? You have the billion-dollar surpluses that Germany has. How are they going to allocate that in terms of climate change things? And then you have the trillion-dollar sovereign wealth funds that a place like UAE or Saudi. How would those two different incentives, how should they look at using that money and dealing with the energy transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're an energy importer, obviously, your incentive structure is less difficult to imagine aligning with energy transition. I think that you're looking at the cost of importing one thing against the cost of producing energy a different way. You're not profiting either way because you have to pay for your energy. And so it may well be in your interests, right, in a purely economic way to transition energy. Although it's really important to think about two things when it comes to renewables. One is security. So it may be that I have reliable supply from an oil producing country that I have a relationship with that means I feel that is safe, or I may not. I may feel that the oil supply is hazardous because of the Strait of Hormuz. And equally, I may feel that solar's cheap, but actually China's producing solar panels, and hooking myself onto that energy supply may create different kinds of security risks. And then the final consideration is going to be around, can I actually produce jobs out of this stuff? Can I use this to develop my own skills, economy, and so forth? So that whole mix comes into play. And I think when you then have any kind of commitment to the climate transition as a collective good, it becomes quite easy to tip the scales in favor of investing in these technologies, and those countries have done. But it's really interesting to note that even then, right, even when you're not profiting from oil underneath your feet, it's been much more of a mixed picture than you'd ideally hope. Germany has made big attempts to establish itself within, for example, the solar market and other green technologies, but it's also got an industrial base it wants to keep competitive that it feels requires it to burn a ton of coal. And so it's hard to say on balance that it's found a pathway to support the transition fully in a way that it sees as in its interests. For the oil producing countries, and so that again is very eye-opening in thinking, well, what does it look like for a country whose economic lifeblood is pumping oil beneath their feet? Sure, they'll still invest their sovereign wealth funds in some green technologies, but it's a lot harder to see a country like that committing fully to the transition.
Yeah, and I think just to jump in here on the German industry point, whether this is the most geopolitically or politically digestible viewpoint or not, but if we take just purely climate being the most important priority, the Middle East region or the Gulf is blessed with not only fossil fuel properties, but also it's a very good place for renewable energy. So we need to think about a world, if we're prioritizing climate, where we shift some of that manufacturing base to the sources of where there is the potential for clean energy supply. The reason that we're not seeing that happen today is because the technical properties with moving clean electricity around the world, we just don't have the technology to be able to do that. We don't have the storage, we don't have transportation to be able to do that. And then we talk about hydrogen as being a potential way to overcome that for the hard to abate sectors. Transporting hydrogen, if you look at the carbon accounting of doing that and the cost, it doesn't make any sense. So it may be that we have to think about a world where we're moving industry and manufacturing to where there is the abundance of clean supply.
I think if we can solve some of these technical challenges around doing industry in a renewable way and continuing to reduce the cost so that rather than just having renewables as part of the addition of new energy, it's actually replacing dirty energy, then you can see countries like Germany, but especially China, being the opposite of an America and actually playing quite a powerful positive role on climate change, because it would become in their naked self-interest to say, stop burning oil, buy our solar panels, right? So their export would actually be clean and would be a kind of globally beneficial, at least on the climate change. Now, they of course, in an adversarial world, if we imagine that continuing, would be doing that with their own self-interest in mind. But it could be really interesting to have a powerful country playing the morality card, even though with back pocket it's in their interest, to say, you've got to stop burning oil and buy our solar panels. That would change the game in terms of reputation and incentive structure.
Please join us after the break as we order the disorder. So, now is the time for us to order the disorder. Olivia, What should Middle Eastern countries be doing that can help the rest of the globe prepare for a cleaner energy future in a way that we all can benefit, our economies and our climate together?
So I think the Gulf countries are blessed with financial resource, geopolitical stability, economic stability, and stable political systems. So they have a lot of the properties of being able to demonstrate a lot of the climate technology that the world needs, and doing that on a scale that can, one, demonstrate it to bring down the cost, doing that at a scale provides lessons and provides incentives to help unlock these technologies for other countries throughout the region. So I think what the Gulf countries can do is really put the appropriate financing, policy, and regulatory conditions in place, as well as work with other producers within the region to set what are the best practices and what are the frameworks and policies that are required. And that can help to unlock that for both the broader region, but also if you do that on a scale that can demonstrate how the rest of the world. So at the moment we debate a lot of technologies, whether it's proven at scale. If we can begin to prove it, then the emissions reductions will speak for themselves.
So the Middle Eastern countries can be test cases for where some of this greener tech, or if not always greener tech, meaning non-hydrocarbons, but better ways of doing hydrocarbon extraction can be tried because it can be economically in their interests. What are the examples of things that might not be in the interests of oil-producing countries and that they might actually want to prevent some global coordination from happening? Hassan.
Broadly speaking, the idea that it is not allowed to extract and sell hydrocarbons would be completely against the desires and interests of those countries, right? They want to see a pathway that preserves their income in the meantime. And so they're quite comfortable in engaging in forums like COP because that is not on the table at the moment. But if you talk to climate activists, they'd like to see a world where it is at least reputationally, if not even legally, international law legally not allowed. And that is definitely a world that these oil-producing countries will fight. I don't want to say fight as in militarily.
But they actually might fight militarily because one of the things we've seen over the last decade is countries like the UAE and Qatar do fund opposing sides of civil wars, such as in places like Libya and maybe also in Syria over a different time scale. And they're happy to see those areas disordered, and they're happy to see a disordered international system because a disordered international system is not one in which taxes on carbon emission can come into being. And that's why I'm worried. Are the oil-producing countries of the Middle East and the powerful ones on the international system, are they orderers or disorderers? And I can see that in some domains the UAE is a great orderer, but then I can see other domains where it's quite a disorderer, for example, in its policy towards Yemen, but maybe also in how it relates to new international institutions coming about. Am I missing something? Are these countries able to play a more ordering role?
So I think I would just underscore that what we can start with is the low-hanging fruit. And I know I sound like a broken record on the methane issue, but it really is the lowest hanging fruit we have. It's something that we can do today. So if we can see the coordination around just committing to stopping methane leakage, and if we can see that globally, we will stop 0.5 degree of the global warming that the world is meant to see. So I think it's really starting there, and that can really be the precursor for coordination around the more challenging aspects.
Love it. Hassan?
Yeah, I don't think that Gulf countries see it in their interest to create a disordered world. I acknowledge that some have been criticized for their role in certain, theaters of conflict as being essentially disordering, but I don't think they see it that way.
Yes.
I think it's about trying to nudge the order in a way that's in their interest. They'd like to nudge it so that hydrocarbon producers can still produce hydrocarbons, but they want the COP process to exist with them as part of it. They don't want to destroy that whole process. And certainly when you zoom out to the whole geopolitical sense of order, with the vulnerabilities and dependencies that these relatively small countries have, they absolutely need order, trade, the ability to get the oil tankers around the Straits of Hormuz. What's happening is, as the geopolitical order shifts from a hegemonic one to a more multipolar one, these are countries that want to make sure they have bets in more than one camp, but fundamentally are the friends of order.
Love it. And I call them the swing states in the order-disorder sweepstakes.
Definitely.
Because if the US and UK and Europe and Japan and Australia can't get the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi on our ordering team, then we're screwed. Because then we certainly can't get some African and Latin American countries who have a lot less vested in the system. These are the countries who want stability, and they want the high quality of life that their citizens have become used to. So we need to win them over to our side. Otherwise, if they are going to throw their lot in with Russia, as in some ways they have done, it's very, very worrying indeed. So, last chance to order to the disorder. Hassan, if you were king for a day and you were appointed global orderer-in-chief, what international institutional body would you create to handle climate change? How would it function?
Well, that's a loaded question because it presumes that we need new bodies. I mean, in my book, The Responsible Globalist, I say, look, if you're an internationalist, you don't need new institutions. You may desire one or two, but the fundamental challenge is not the existence of institutions. It's their legitimacy and ability to act effectively to solve collective action problems. And the reason for that is that countries that are the board, the owners, the governance of these institutions, these international institutions, are not effectively incentivized by their people to do the right thing. And that is fundamentally what I would change. All countries, people think, well, democracies only. No, all countries are responding to what their citizens demand from them in one way or another. None of them are just taking orders directly from their citizens.
Correct. And sometimes autocracies actually more respond to what their citizens want because they can plan ahead and anticipate citizen needs.
Well, also because they may fear their citizens more as well.
100%.
Right? They don't have the mandate that allows them to say, I'm going to ignore 40% because the 60% voted for me. Right. So all of these countries are listening to what their people are wanting them to do as they show up in these bodies. And a global citizenry that thinks about their belonging to humanity and the need to solve global challenges as one of the many layers of their identity, and one that they make salient politically when saying it is not politically acceptable for my prime minister to come back from COP and say, oh, we didn't do much. It is not politically acceptable for my country to be seen as having a reputation as not solving these problems. Then you start having heads roll politically, and those decision makers who empower the international bodies to do their work see it as in their narrow interest to keep their jobs, to do the right thing. And then you'll find the multilateral system thriving.
Wow, what a great answer. And I'm going to try to digest this for you mega orderers out there. What Hassan has put his finger on is that reputation and the iterative nature of the game theory game is essential for it to all work. If we only played one game once, everyone would make the selfish decision. But it's because we have to live together. The Israelis are going to live next to the Palestinians. There's no way around it. And the Palestinians are going to live next to these Jews. They are going to. And they're going to play multiple games against each other. You want to have a reputation that if you sign the agreement, you actually deliver. And it is that we have these discussions together, and then he who did the thing he said he was going to do, he gets a reputational advantage, and maybe he gets more business investment, or people are willing to trust him. And this is something that I've learned in gambling. You only have one reputation in this world. And if you stiff someone in Copenhagen, you lost and you didn't pay, someone in Japan is going to hear that story and they're going to be like, I'm never playing with this guy. He stiffed Hans and I heard about this. So this is the way it's got to be. We've got to punish countries and companies who don't do their obligations if they said that they were going to. And I think a failure that the global enduring disorder puts out is there's so much misinformation and there's so much ping-ponging back and forth of these complexities that people think they can get away with hoodwinking others on what they actually did. So great point, Hassan. But now the question is, what would Olivia do? It's not if she was queen for a day, because for those of you who are seeing this little YouTube clip, you can see she's queen every day. And therefore, if you were queen every day, Olivia, what international institutional body would you create to handle climate change, and how would it function?
Yeah, so I think I would build on some of the excellent points Hassan made. And with the climate challenge, there is never a greater need for public-private action. And I would also put philanthropic action in there as well, because you do have individuals and companies that are wealthier than some governments. So we do need to think collectively about how can we drive talent and drive trust and drive a collective understanding into the importance of climate as a public good and a public policy priority. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about climate, we're talking about human beings and our right to exist on this planet in a healthy way. And collectively, we need to reignite trust in why these public services and why these public goods are something that humanity needs to get behind. So I would inject a lot more talent, trust, and a lot more physical power and might into those institutions.
Love it. To order the disorder, we need a Singapore-level approach in all of the major countries of the world, whereby you get paid investment banker-level money to work in the public sector and invent stuff. I love it.
And also have the willingness, because I think what you talked about earlier.
And where you get investment banker and doctor social respect for working in the public sector. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground. So thank you to Olivia and Hassan for ordering the disorder with me. And thank you, mega orderers out there, for listening to this. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. If you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to our Substack. The link is in the show notes. I'm going to have an extended thing on climate issues and ways in which we can tackle them and the role of the Middle East in the climate crisis. If you like what you're hearing, please follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And listeners, I hope you have a more orderly week than we had an orderly podcast discussion. Thank you.